In this lesson, we'll see how to create and display one-to-many relationships using foreign keys. This will allow us to define the client of each purchase order. Let's start by creating the order entity and right-click here, add an entity, call it order. And we'll have to add a couple of attributes to this entity. The first one will be the submit date. And before I add the next attribute, let me just create here a diagram and show the entities we have so far on this diagram. So the client, the products, and also the order. Now, the next attribute that we're going to create for the order is the one that will allow me to specify the client for each order. So let's add here a client ID. And when I'll press enter, take notice of what happens here in the diagram. Now, see, this created a relationship between the client and the order entity. In the platform, relationships are created by defining an attribute that references another entity. This is usually called a foreign key, and in this case, this attribute, the client ID, references the client entity because the data type of this attribute is actually client identifier. Okay, so let me set the attributes as mandatory. So the submit date is mandatory. The client ID is also mandatory. And finally, let me define a default value for the submit date. Whenever a new record is created, this attribute will have this value by default. And you can type here a value that matches the data type of this attribute. And for dates, for instance, for the date data type, you can use here the function to return the current date when the record is created. That's what we're going to use. Okay, so we finished defining the data model. Let's publish before we continue to create the screens. Okay, so back to the interface, and let's change here the home page, and we're going to create the orders screen where we're going to list the orders. And don't forget to tick the anonymous role. Remember, we don't want to handle security at this point. We'll deal with this later on. Now to create the list screen, let's open the screen. Let's give it a title, orders, and we will need to put a widget here to populate the orders. But before we do that, we need to fetch them from the database. And for that, we will need to add a preparation to the screen and fetch the orders using an aggregate. Now, notice that while I'm dragging the order entity into the aggregate, the client entity is also brought along. So when two related entities are added to an aggregate, a join condition is created to define how the records from both entities are combined. Since the client ID is a mandatory attribute, you will see here in the sources menu, you will see both of the entities, and you see the join condition. And as I was saying, since this is a mandatory attribute, the join condition that was created will return the results where we will find orders only with clients. Okay, so we're done for this. Let me sort the results that we will get from this aggregate, and I want to sort the results by the order identifier. We are actually going to show the order ID in the interface. So let me unhide the order ID, which was hidden by default. So usually you don't show identifiers in the user interface, but in this case we are going to show the order ID, and let me sort the orders from A to Z. Okay, so we're done fetching the data. Let's get back to the screen, and we will need to add a table records to the screen. Bind these table records to the result of the aggregate that we have on the preparation. So here, get orders list, That's the one we want. And define the structure of what we want to show. And what we want to show on the table records are orders, so drag and drop the order entity. And this will bring along also the client name. So again, the OutSystems platform determines that since this is a foreign key, since the client ID is a foreign key to the client entity, this is going to get the name of the client and put it here in the table instead of showing this identifier. Now, as I said, I want to show the order ID in the table, so let me drag and drop the order ID there. And that's it. We're done for now for the orders screen. Let's go back to the main flow and let's create the order details so that we can create orders in our application. We are going to use this order detail also to edit the order, so we will need to have an input parameter, order ID, and we will need a preparation to fetch this order ID from the database. So, and I'm going to show you here a trick. So usually what you do is that you drag an aggregate into the flow, you drag the entity into the aggregate, and you create the filter to get the order where the identifier is this input parameter. A shortcut for you to do all of this in only one operation is to drag and drop the input parameter into the flow, and this will create the same aggregate to get the order with the filter already created. Okay, so this is a neat trick for you to use and to save some time in implementing your features. Okay, so we're done with the preparation. Let's go back to the screen and let's add a title. So remember that we need to test if the order ID is null or not. Let's add an UI if, set the condition when our input parameter is null. Then we will show here new order. When it's not null, let me just say that we are watching the order number and add an expression with the order ID. So double click here, select the order ID from the aggregate, the current element, order ID. Okay, so we're done for the title. We will need to add a form into the main content area. So drag and drop a form. Bind the form to the aggregate in the preparation, to the result of the aggregate actually, so the current element again, and drag and drop the order entity into the form. Okay, so submit date, the client. We will need a button to send this information back to the server. Save, double click to create the action and bind it to the button. And here we are going to use again the creator update order. Set the source parameter to use the record property of the form. We're done. And now redirect the user back to the order screen. Okay, save action is done. Let's add a cancel button as well. Here, label it cancel. And again, when the button is pressed, redirect the user to the order screen. And we're done for the order detail. And don't forget to tick the anonymous role. I was almost forgetting this. Let me go back into the main flow. We need to be able to navigate into the order detail, and we will do this to edit the order. So we'll need to create a link here in the table records. So link to the order detail and set the order ID parameter, and also add a new order link here on the actions. New order, link to order detail. And in this case, since we don't have the order ID, we want to create a new one. We will pass the null identifier special value. Okay, so we're done. Let's publish and create a couple of orders in our application. Okay, so here we have the orders list. We don't have any orders yet. Let's create a new one. And as you can see, the submit date was filled with the default value. And now I want to set the client. Let's set Alexa and save. There we have the first order. We can edit this order and say that it's Alan, for instance, and save. It's okay. Let's try to create a new order, and let's try not to define the client and save this order. And as you can see, this returned an error. And this returned an error because we set the client as a mandatory attribute, and we didn't fill in. Later on, we will see how to handle validation in these forms, but for now, it's just to assure you that when you set a foreign key as mandatory, this will be validated and the order was not created by this operation. That's it.